Myths and magic. Let's talk about it. For as long as I've been playing Dwarf Fortress, there has been talk of this mythical thing. Wizards. Back in the ancient history of 2005, Tarn Adams was plucking away and working on Dwarf Fortress, a side project video game from his main project, Slaves to Armok, God of Blood. Dwarf Fortress was supposed to be a short 3-month experiment, a simple arcade game that was set to be released shortly after its quick development. However, the game eventually ballooned and is still in active development until this day. And one of the original planned features for that ancient version of the game was an undead siege. Essentially, a character would show up and select one of your dwarves. That character was a wizard, and your dwarf would begin having nightmares. And if you looked at their thoughts within their brain, they would foretell a dark reality. The undead were coming. Eventually, this would lead to a horde of undead arriving at your fortress, which quite clearly would topple most fortresses that weren't prepared. And even if you were prepared, it was planned to be a very large threat. However, when the first playable versions of Dwarf Fortress released in 2006, the wizards were nowhere to be found. But you did still get attacked by the undead. And because of their somewhat forgotten nature, until this day, wizards have remained simply a page on the wiki, informing the player, or in this case the reader, a wizard is a magical person who is merely the stuff of legends. They do not actually exist, appearing only in engravings, as the fancy of artists. As there is no such thing as magic, all dwarves know this, and anyone who says otherwise is surely an elven trickster. So ever since the beginning, magic has been a planned feature for Dwarf Fortress, and as the time would go on and the game would develop a small community and following, the question would constantly come up. What about wizards? And when are we getting the magic update? Over the years, through the various forms of discussion around Dwarf Fortress, Tarn has started to talk about two very specific things that have reached mythical status within the Dwarf Fortress community. The first of these is the long wait. If you've been playing the game for some time, you may notice that when the game generates a world and you start building a fortress, there are pretty obvious gaps in the world generation. Things that can be spotted in the surface of tree lines, where you can very clearly see the different blocks that are gluing the world together. Not to mention the very similar looking towns and cities, and the incredibly abstract, hard to navigate, and strangely designed dwarven fortresses. These are all things that Tarn has really expressed a desire to fix over the years. And while the world does simulate a lot of very interesting things and create very in-depth histories about every single individual world, there are very clearly some limitations in the game's ability to generate worlds. This brings us to the first bit of Dwarf Fortress history that Tarn has been talking about, frankly, as long as I can remember. The long wait. One of the oldest pieces of code in Dwarf Fortress is the world generation. In 2007, Dwarf Fortress went from 2 dimensions to 3 dimensions, allowing you to scroll up and down vertically within an individual map, creating a 3-dimensional space out of 2D planes, allowing for both verticality as well as a lot of variety in the maps themselves. The result of this also meant that there was a huge amount of space for the player to actually build. And while these systems were extremely impressive for the time, they have begun to show their age, and they need to be overhauled so that they can properly represent what the game is capable of now. Tarn has described many issues with this version of the code over the years. Players have also encountered problems with it in the form of slowdown, or the mythical FPS death. And that brings us to Dwarf Fortress's dirty secret. Everything on the map that the player can see, and what the player can't see while playing Fortress mode, is loaded into memory. The game doesn't make stuff disappear. You know, when you're playing a first-person shooter and you do a 360 and spin around, everything that's behind the player character doesn't exist. It disappears from the render. In Dwarf Fortress, regardless of what you're looking at on the map, everything is actively being processed and rendered. So whether or not the camera is actively looking at a portion of the map, the game itself is processing it and knows that it is there. So if you are looking at one end of your fortress and seeing 10 dwarves working on their workshops, for all we know, somewhere deep underground, there is a kobold repeatedly stabbing an undead gremlin in the chest and it won't die because it's undead. The result of this is the game sort of slows down a bit. And while this has improved a whole lot as the game has developed, and it's still a fact that having all of this stuff loaded into memory in a map that is hundreds of layers tall can be a lot, even on modern CPUs. Because the game is completely deterministic and only one action can be processed at a time on your CPU core. Computers are a lot faster now than they were in 2007, so even though the game runs significantly better than it did in the past, there are still times where the frame rate will get very, very, very bad. But let's bring this back around to my original point. Tarn has been talking about the long wait, and the long wait is set to remedy this problem, or at least it was supposed to remedy this problem. This problem being the world generation code, being functionally ancient and in desperate need of an update. However, rewriting the entire underpinning of the game will take a lot of time, or at least would have taken a lot of time for Tarn to do by himself. However, rewriting the world generation code would allow for several things to be implemented, the first of which being myths and magic, allowing for both prehistory generation and greatly increasing the variety of types of generation that the game would be capable of supporting. This led to Tarn musing in various formats about procedurally generated spells, procedurally generated races, procedurally generated religions with magic associated with them, and of course, wizards. But just like reality, in Dwarf Fortress development, time is not a linear thing. And so what was talked about in 2009 and before might not be implemented until the mid-2020s, as we have seen in reality. In 2016, we got to see something really cool as the Dwarf Fortress community. Tarn attended GDC, the Game Developers Conference, and showed off a prototype where you could see myth generation in real time. Now, this wasn't something that was worked into the game properly at this point, but it was something that we got as a glimpse into Tarn's ideas of what he wanted for magic generation. It posed a sort of prehistory that would be very moddable by the player, with all sorts of parameters exposed. In the prototype, you can see a creation myth being generated in real time. It shows each of the main races, and it seems to work by creating the named gods that currently exist in the game, and then it ties them to different parts of the world using keywords. You can see how the great Thephidius, I'm probably mispronouncing that, awakened and then mated with the oceans, bearing the land of the timeless rhythm, which permeates the universe, spontaneously forming animals. The god in this case disturbed the land, forming the Pillar of Smite. If you scroll down in this screen grab that I have from the video, you can then see what entities it's associated with. This is just one portion of a creation myth for one of the different factions. The game in this prototype would generate myths for the humans, the dwarves, the elves, and the goblins, as well as any other existing races in the world. The abstractness of these world generations would then be tied to every single element within the world creation. This would allow for incredibly abstract worlds, which are so magically diverse that they are not even playable, all the way down to the fairly mundane worlds that we currently play in. So far, we know that the long wait would allow for this to be tied to every part of world generation. And as time would go on, Tarn would do other talks where he would talk about procedurally generated spells that are tied to the myth generator, as well as the map rewrites allowing for things such as portals to other dimensions and being able to follow your armies from a location all the way across the world to a location where they go and do combat, making each and every world completely unique, potentially, if all of his ambitions would come to fruition. And all of this was supposed to happen in one update, known as the Long Wait. But then something threw a wrench into Tarn's plans. In 2019, Dwarf Fortress announced that there was going to be a version of the game releasing on Steam, for a fee. And while most people who at the time weren't playing Dwarf Fortress due to its obtuseness were very excited about the Steam version, and many of the players who were playing Dwarf Fortress were excited for it to become more accessible, concerns were arisen as to how long would it take before we actually see this so-called long wait and magic update. I would like to recap here for a second. In order for the magic update, as Tarn envisions it, to happen, the world map generation code needs to be rewritten. Because if only what the player is currently looking at in the fortress was rendered and held in memory, and everything that was outside of your line of sight was simply stored in cold storage, that would allow the game maps to be significantly larger, and potentially allow for portals to jump from one world to another, requiring a long wait for all of the world generation code to be rewritten, and the myth and magic update to be released. But all of that was put on pause, because the game was going to be released on Steam. In 2019, the Steam version was announced, but Tarn didn't actually start working on it fully until late 2020 or early 2021. In December 2022, Dwarf Fortress, Fortress Mode, would release on Steam, but it was still missing Adventure Mode. That would take another year of development time. However, The income from the Steam version allowed them to hire Putnam, who has been diligently working on optimizing and bug fixing the game since the Steam release. And more recently, it was announced that Putnam was converting a lot of the RAWs in Dwarf Fortress to Lua, allowing for scripting over top of the current code. And I think that this is lost on a lot of players, because what this actually means is that not as much of the world generation code is going to need to be rewritten, and the parts that do need to be rewritten will be rewritten with Lua scripting in mind, making the current code more contortable and modifiable than it was traditionally. Because the development of Dwarf Fortress has fundamentally changed with the release of the Steam version, there won't be a long wait. Tarn won't need to pause working on the game entirely and rewrite huge swaths of the game from the ground up. Instead, the game is going to be worked on in small portions. And the long wait is already underway. I realize this might seem like a bold claim. Historically, Dwarf Fortress's development has been quite slow, and people joke about it to this day. But on average, since the release on Steam, Dwarf Fortress has gotten a patch every other month. There have been breaks from time to time, but bug fixes and regular maintenance updates are a consistent reality now. This wasn't the case in the past, and features, including features of myths and magic, have been slowly trickling into the game, with every major content patch. If we circle back around to Tarn's prototype that he showed at GDC in 2016, you can see the creation myth for each of the main races, as well as named locations. All of this follows the same structure as what the game currently is capable of. And some of what we can see in the GDC talk has actually been added to the game within the last year. We have also since learned that there are three main aspects to magic: prehistory generation, as shown in the prototype, world generation settings, similar to what we have in the game already, that will allow the player to designate how magic their world is going to be, essentially setting the world's potency, allowing you to decide whether or not you want a more mundane world, similar to what we play in now, or a more fantastic world that would allow us to break out of the 1400s era technology that the game tends to stick to, or at least roughly tries to stick to. And the third and final impact is gameplay. This is everything from magical spells that the player will be able to use and develop, magic potions and weapons that are in some format already in the game, and in the far future, the ability to link worlds together with portals. This is the third function because it's how it will directly manifest in-game, and what the player will see as they control their dwarven fortresses and adventures. And for those of you chomping at the bit, we do actually have some good news. We will be seeing some of this magic really soon, but I kind of left a red herring a moment ago, that some of this magic is already in the game. So what is already available to the player right now? In one of my final callbacks to the prototype, there are magic fragments mentioned, and they've been accessible on the main branch since Adventure Mode released in January 2025. The magic fragments don't do much right now. They're simply an item that's tied to a sphere which is related to a god, meaning a god of wind and nature would be associated with spheres related to wind and nature, whereas a god of light and mountains would be associated with mountains and light. These magic fragments are mundane items. They don't do anything aside from being a simple fetch and deliver quest item for Adventure Mode. The fragments can be found scattered around the overworld map in various mysterious sites. The quests that these items are connected to in Adventure Mode are quite simple. By default, you are given one of these quests if you play as a Chosen, allowing you to directly communicate with your god, who directs you to a temple associated with the god that your character worships. Once you arrive, you are informed that you must go fetch an item for the priest, being these mundane items. But later on in these quest lines, you're then sent to mysterious dungeons instead of just the lairs, which have tougher enemies as well as magical weapons, which are then usable via the player's ability screen. I have found weapons that immediately destroy armor. I've found weapons that have the ability to push and pull and shoot ice shards out of my hands. I've found weapons that have the ability to cause pain and make enemies dizzy and immediately projectile vomit, as well as things like blinding. In all of these sites, you can find healing potions. Sometimes they can be found in containers on the ground in these locations, and other times they are in a flask on the belt of an enemy that you are tasked with killing. These magic potions will regenerate all limbs and injuries that the player has sustained, healing permanent ailments, and even curing tiredness. This is a pretty simple system on its surface, and currently only available primarily in one of the two modes. However, there are some sneaky ways to get these magic potions into your fortress, and force dwarves to drink them, or consume them, which does have the desired effect on your dwarves in fortress mode. The weapons can also be acquired in fortress mode, but I've had mixed success getting the dwarves to actually use the powers associated with them. In order to understand why this simple system is actually quite exciting for Dwarf Fortress, you have to take one step back and look at other systems such as necromancers, who can also create procedural creatures. Every system in Dwarf Fortress is loosely tied together. The more base level mechanics the game has, the more systems can be added on top of them, increasing the variety and variation in what you will encounter. As a first pass and base level for magic, this is a very exciting feature. Similarly to how necromancers can create their magical experiments. These are contorted monsters that are twisted from the formations of other creatures that existed in the world, kidnapped victims and then turned into Frankenstein's monsters. Sometimes they're successful and act as members of society, while other times they are amorphous blobs that exist to be used as cannon fodder. Necromancers can also create their intelligent undead. These are the pale blue zombies, smarter than the normal zombies that simply shamble towards the enemy, and have the ability to use some of the magic powers that are attached to the weapons. But that's just what's in the game right now. When people ask me when is the magic update, I have to say, truthfully, it's already here, because the base level fragments of the magic update are already in the game. All of the foundation has been prepared. It's just a matter of beginning to add layers to the systems, and continue to quietly rewrite the world generation code behind the scenes. So what's next? After Adventure Mode released in early 2025, and the first pass of Lua rewrites was completed, we got the update to Sieges in November. But that's the first half of the promised features for Sieges. The second half are a little bit more explodey. I'll let Tarn explain.
We're going to need to do a little bit of fundamental work to understand what the hell is going on out there. And I think that's where we're gonna have to start. So just getting some of the new players in play in World Gen, things like the demon sorcerers, and a bit more understanding of what sort of other wizards are in the world, and understanding deity inflected things that people can do. So we'll get that. So offense, defense, resistance, and nullification, all on the table. And it's one of these things where we list these things out. They're not hard to implement, and then we have to actually see it in play, probably to have a good sense of where it's at. We figured, if we've got demon trained sorcerers and we got necromancers, all these bad things going on out there, it's like that is not the only kind of wizard we want to have. And so we're going to do some stuff, and we're going to let them live in your fortress, because that's fun.
Well, now you've heard it from the man himself. We are getting magic spells in the near future, alchemy, and temples that somehow power said magic spells. The goblins will be getting demon-trained sorcerers. Whatever those end up looking like in-game, it sounds like it will be a threat. And the dwarves, for the player, are getting wizards, and presumably the other faction will also get these wizards. From the description of them, they sound like traveling merchants in a way. Somebody that you either request or shows up, at which point you can assign them to an alchemy zone and begin crafting your spells, if you will. As for what this will actually look like in-game and what those explosions that Tarn talks about are going to end up playing like, all I can do is speculate. I haven't seen any of this myself, but I am excited to get my hands on the first updates when they release. This is coming alongside of better diplomacy for the overworld, which is something the game has sorely needed for a while, as well as some semblance of overworld army control, making the game a little bit more 4X-like. My biggest concern, if I were to voice any about these changes, would simply be the readability of it in-game, as combat situations in Dwarf Fortress can get kind of messy. I'm excited for the myth generator. I'm looking forward to what that will do to the world's history. I'm looking forward to gods and religions in Dwarf Fortress having more context, allowing us to explore and get to know our worlds even better than before, due to added complexity. I'm curious and optimistic about what these wizards and demon-trained sorcerers are going to end up playing like in the game, and I'm excited for any kind of new workshops along the lines of alchemy. As with everything in Dwarf Fortress, there's a lot of unknowns and a lot of questions. But the one question that I can answer with a good degree of certainty at this point is the long wait is over, and the updates containing the content for myths and magic have already started to release.